Are you a high achiever, constantly overwhelmed by work anxiety? Does self-doubt and pressure hinder your performance, but also your personal well-being? When you try to unwind, do thoughts of work and the crushing pressure of all your responsibilities still cloud your mind and somewhat hinder your peace of mind? If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. In today's episode, Richard Sutton shares groundbreaking tools and mindset shifts to help you manage stress, build resilience, and elevate your work performance. Richard Sutton is the founder of Sutton Health and the Performance Code. He works with CEOs globally and companies around the world to improve resilience and performance. With more than 20 years experience in the world of professional sports, Richard has also worked with top-ranked tennis players, winning Olympic teams, and countless athletes. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Charles and Giselle Show. I am delighted to introduce you to our very special guest today, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
And it's great to have you, Richard. I was reflecting on my trip to South Africa this summer and how I took a little stroll down the waterfront and came across your wonderful book, got instantly attracted to the very powerful title, Thrive, The Power of Resilience, bought it, loved it, devoured it, read it within a couple of days, and here you are.
So very grateful for that stroll, and thank you for reaching out.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Richard, could you take us a little bit through perhaps the story behind the decision to come up with this book and to write on the topic of resilience?
So it's quite interesting because everything's a little bit of a long story, but it goes back to the journey of all my titles. And I began with my first book, The Stress Code. And it really was a call to action because a few years ago, the world was really struggling in the stress domain. And it was a book that was strategic in terms of helping and supporting individuals and professionals cope and manage their stress. So it was very, very stress-centric. But stress is about the here and the now. It's about getting through the challenges that we're confronted with and getting to the other side in many respects. That book was followed by Stress Proof, which was very much centered around, as a leader, how do we protect and buffer our people, our teams, our families, our community, and what do we need to do? And it's very different from managing one's personal stress, but fundamentally, we can't help and support others unless we are okay in and unto ourselves. So that was very much kind of that narrative and that period of time. Now, Thrive is almost the next step. And the next step is an acknowledgement that the world is pretty challenging. It's complex, it's uncertain, it's volatile. We don't know what's around the corner. We came out of COVID and into two major wars. It's really shaken the whole geopolitical set. And we fundamentally have to acknowledge that the future is going to be uncertain, and we have to upskill. We have to develop our self-awareness, and we have to develop our self-control, and we have to develop a certain sense of accountability, and we have to take action. And we can enjoy life, and we can realize our dreams and aspirations and hopes and experience happiness and fulfillment. But there's a different set of conditions that need to be created within ourselves because of the complexities and challenges that exist around.
And why resilience, right? Because that is what drew me to the book. And I love the fact that you picked that as a subtitle as opposed to optimizing well-being or improving health. It's that idea of resilience. Tell us a little bit about why resilience specifically.
So resilience, I think that we've understood resilience very much within the framework of grit and persistence and perseverance and mental toughness, whatever that is, and emotion suppression. So if you're resilient, you're putting your emotions under the bed. And if you're resilient, you can kind of handle more pain than everyone else. And if you're resilient, you've got more persistence than anyone else. And the reality is those notions seem to be somewhat outdated. Yes, grit and persistence are incredible traits, and they will get you across the line of life and to your aspirations, but at a cost. So you arrive at your destination weathered and beaten and broken and battered, and it really doesn't reflect what resiliency truly is. And that is this capacity to weather the storms, to get up off the ground 100 times if you've been knocked down, 99 times. And each time we get up, we're a better version of ourselves. The person we were yesterday is no longer, and we're that little bit better, and we're that little bit more proficient, and a little bit more competent, and a little bit more fulfilled, and a little bit more complete. So resiliency really is this capacity to keep changing and adapting and growing and evolving. And it has many facets and many layers to it.
And Richard, in your expert opinion, is resilience something that one is born with, or is resilience something that is an acquired skill?
So I don't know if I'm the expert, but in many respects, I think, it's a bit of both. A couple of years ago, I partnered with a biotechnology lab, and we built a test, a genetic test, to assess the most influential genes in resiliency. And it involves 7 different fundamental neurochemical systems and hormonal systems. And if you're endowed with certain genes, you just have a greater capacity to handle stress and challenge and change. This being said, it also is an acquired skill. We can create our realities, we can shape our environments, we can change our personality. It's a decision. And that kind of meets in this middle point, because it's a paradox. How can it be inherited and how can it be a skill? And the reality is that the genes that we inherit are not our reality. They're just part of a reality that we have a choice in creating. And if we are able to put together the right behaviors, be consistent in those behaviors, create the right environments for ourselves, and really be the author of our own scripts, no matter what genes you're born with, no matter what environment you came from, you can develop these skills which can become attributes. They become part of us. And there was such a great saying, I saw it a couple of days ago, and it was, it's not about faking it until you make it. It's about faking it until you become it. And it really stuck with me.
And what I really love about your work is how you actually analyze the connection, or rather correlation, between personality types and resilience, or rather personality and lack of resilience, or ability to become more resilient. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, those personality types and resilience, and the interaction that it has? Because I find that work particularly fascinating.
So a lot of the research, the clinical research, is on populations that have been exposed to challenge and adversity, not by choice, just through circumstance. And what research scientists have uncovered, and very consistently over many decades, is that fundamentally those individuals who are more optimistic, and those individuals who are more agreeable, and those individuals who are more open, and those individuals who are more conscientious, and those individuals who are more extroverted generally do better. They handle the change and they handle the setbacks with less impact on their emotional, mental, and physical well-being. So those are intrinsic or inherent personality traits that we think that we either have it or not. We're either extrovert or we're not. But the reality is we have a choice. We can be extroverted in some domains and introverted in other domains. And it's really about a commitment, a commitment to being different, a commitment to stepping out of one's comfort zone. And the context, from my standpoint, I've been very introverted my entire life. And the reality of my current profession is that it's a very extroverted profession. I have to, this year I spoke to maybe 10,000 people over the entire year. And it's become one of those scenarios. And the evolution from an introvert to an extrovert took a lot of time, a lot of practice, a lot of repetition, but eventually it became a reality. And why extroversion is such a great trait in terms of resilience is that it makes us connect with the world. And when we connect with others and we share our experiences, we become stronger and we become more capable and we become more confident in many respects. So these are all traits. Conscientiousness is about habits and planning and structure and organization, and that also contributes. So there's a very strong correlation, but it's not to say that if you don't fit into these boxes, you can't become that a version of yourself in that domain.
So just to summarize for our audience that may or may not be familiar with those 5 personality tests, or 5 personality types rather, you've mentioned conscientiousness, extroversion, there is also openness, emotional stability, and agreeableness. Could you tell us a little bit, like maybe some case studies or a little bit of example of what one might have as a trait to know that they can identify to one of those personality, for example?
The thing is that these traits are on a scale. So let's say openness. You can rate yourself one in the book. I got like a rating of 1 to 10. And if you are extremely open, you enjoy new experiences. It's just who you are, and you're curious. You want to learn about lots of different things, and you're maybe a little bit unconventional. You're a little bit nonconformist, a little bit unorthodox, and you're very imaginative. The reality that's presented in front of you doesn't have to be your reality, and that's really the signature of openness. Conversely, the other side of openness is very much, I'm closed to new ideas. This is what I know. This is what I do. This is my reality. I'm not moving out of the comfort zone. We become very imprisoned by patterns and predictability. We don't want to change it. We save, being in this less open state. And we grow into this conservative being in many respects. So that's a very good example of openness. Conscientiousness, which is one of those big 5 traits as well. Conscientiousness is about discipline. It's about self-accountability, and it's about self-control. And it's a massive resilience piece in itself. It's a big resilience story. So if we're conscientious, that discipline really, really resonates throughout our life, and we become very organized and become very goal-orientated and responsible and accountable for ourselves, accountable for others. And conscientiousness, you can just see by those characteristics and traits, it's foundational in terms of success and interactions with the world and certainly leadership. On the other side of conscientiousness, we see that those who are not that conscientious can be impulsive and a little bit unreliable and less organized, and we tend to procrastinate, and we become reactive and very unmeasured to emotional situations. Again, these scales are rating scales. We're not a 10 or a 1. We're always sitting somewhere in the middle, and it depends on where we are in our lives. So these traits are really remarkable in terms of, and the book, I think page 37 on the book really explores the notion of these different traits and where we sit, how we see ourselves and how others see us, and where our opportunity for work and growth and evolvement sits and lies.
I find that's very interesting. And do you think there is also a correlation between those traits and our willingness to work and deliver, and perhaps a potential to be more prone to burnout or chronic anxiety? And the reason I ask you that is, in my practice, I see a lot of high achievers, and they are very conscientious, and they are very, very determined. They're very open, they're great leaders, but they also have a tendency to burn themselves out because they do that extra mile constantly, and they find it really hard to press pause and very hard to know when to stop and know when to recover. Can you tell us a little bit about that in your experience?
Yeah, in my experience, it's a world that I'm all too familiar with. And the strange thing about burnout is there's one relationship that one must always factor in. And I'm not the expert in burnout, but it's something that I've had to contend with and deal with throughout my career. And that relationship is very much centered on this raw ambition, this wanting to achieve, this wanting to be better, this wanting to grow, this wanting to have this ultimate success, whatever it might be, monetary, it might be prestige, it might be reputational, it might be, it's considered on a continuum, but it's that raw ambition with a lack of self-care, to the extent where that raw ambition becomes completely overwhelming. It becomes our entire reality. And we have to explore where this emanates from. Does this emanate from a need to prove oneself to oneself, prove oneself to others? Does it come from not having a fallback? Sometimes we have to be successful because there's no alternative. Is it related to just inherently, I have an incredibly robust dopaminergic and norepinephrine set, the neurochemicals that are about the outside world and about achieving and about exploring new realities. One has to understand where this drive comes from. And drive in itself is very positive, but I've yet to meet someone who's burnt out that's not ambitious. So it's this combination between, this wanting to achieve and just total neglect of self. And we always see that self as, it's the physical, it's what you're eating, it's the supplements you take or don't take, it's the nature you expose yourself or don't expose yourself to. And it's bigger than that. It's sometimes it's that inner neglect. So it's a strange journey that burnout takes you on, because initially it's quite innocuous. It's not that extreme. You start with where it's all about work, and it's all about this project, and it's about getting it to completion and getting it out, within the deadline, and everything else becomes sidelined. So there's no time for non-work related activities, and you can justify that. And you start denying to yourself and to others that you've lost this flexibility and you've lost this agility. And the agility that you're starting to lose, you're starting to imprison yourself by these projects, is very much mental and emotional. So here we've got less time for anything that's not work-related or project-related. And then also this trying to convince yourself that that's not the case, and it becomes a set. And then it starts to progress. It starts to progress in terms of withdrawing from everything else. I'm withdrawing from the world. I start becoming a little bit cynical. I start, all the direction and focus I used to have, I start losing it. It becomes all too consuming and all too overwhelming. It's seeing no space and no distance within anything that we're trying to pursue. And then that materializes, and it's sequential in emotional behaviors, behavioral changes and emotional reactivity. And then you start disconnecting and you start disassociating. And then the experience of just emptiness. What is the point? What is this all for? And you might try and overcome that by being a little bit more obsessive and putting more and investing more. And the obsessiveness ultimately culminates in anxiety. And it's a crazy thing, because the next stage almost looks like depression in many respects. And the next stage is a lack of interest, no meaning, no purpose in life. And you've got this overlay between two experiences, the anxiety and the obsessive behaviors, with the disconnect and the withdrawal and the hopelessness. So what we can say in many respects is it's almost an overlay of depression and anxiety as a combined set. And the final stage is the physical stage, the stage that we all know and we all understand: the physical depletion, exhaustion, the pain, the injuries, the being run down permanently. And that's the one that we relate to. But we seldom reflect on all these processes and all these stages that take place before we arrive at that destination.
Richard, can I ask you a question here? Because I think the way you've described the journey into burnout is so spot on. And I'm just putting myself in the shoes of one of our listeners today and just picking out, a random name. Let's say we have, George with us today listening, and he's listened to everything that you've said, and he's going, yep, I tick that box. I have huge amount of ambition. I used to have this extraordinary drive. People called me a force of nature, and I've always been known in my organization to be one of the top leader. But George also recognizes that over the past years, he's really not looked after himself. He's sacrificed self-care. He's looked harder at proving himself or proving that self. He's become very obsessive. And George has now entered that phase which you talked about so clearly, where he's now anxious, he's now hopeless, and that obsession and that drive has turned into a lack of care, almost a lack of interest, a feeling of emptiness. What would you say to George today, using the tools that you have and the knowledge that you have gained over all the years of research around resilience and stress management? Where would be a healthy place to start?
So I would say that, George wouldn't be best served by taking a week or two off. I think that is almost a token strategy. Doesn't achieve much in the long term. And this is about the long term. I think that George is strategic in his professional work. He's always approached things with this long-term vision. And burnout, we seem to think that burnout is, the ICD in 2019 classified it as a disease. So, I mean, it has a symptom set. It might even have a treatment course. But The reality is you're dealing with something very significant. And why I said significant is because it diminishes our potential by 40%. We have 40% less of what we're capable of in and through the experience of burnout. And without getting into the neurobiology, there is a biomarker. There's a protein that you can evaluate that if there's a diminishment in the circulating levels of this protein, specifically and especially within the brain, by 15%, you will experience these symptoms. And it's a tremendous lever that we can pull on. But the point is not about a single thing and a molecule and a lever that one can pull on. The point is that we have to be strategic. Just as stress management, just as resilience promotion and augmentation, burnout is something where we have to look at it in the long term and look at it with a sense of strategy. And it gives us a tremendous degree of comfort because within the strategy, there's control. And the strategy, as in everything, really has 4 parts. And we understand the physical. So if you're going to take a break, it's the physical that you're probably exploring to the greatest degree. But there's a cognitive element. There's a social element. There's a behavioral element. There's 4 elements that have to be very neatly and delicately kind of interwoven in order to create this complete resolution. So I think that the most people will resonate with the physical as the first departure point. Yeah, I'm physically depleted. I'm always injured. I'm always sick. I feel absolutely drained. I have nothing in the tank. Where do I start on this process? And you think that the starting point is going to really center around a little bit more vigilance on diet, a little bit more vigilance on nutritional supplements, and that's helpful. But the starting point is boundaries. Step 1 in the physical domain is boundaries. And what are the boundaries that we have to start considering? First is technology. This is the thing that is keeping that elevated state of arousal. So norepinephrine, epinephrine is constantly circulating throughout our veins. And if we can say to ourselves between this time and this time, I can phones and computers, and that's all fantastic. But there has to be a turn-off point. I need to balance my system between arousal and recovery. And we always look at it. This is a crazy thing because we always look at high performance. We say that high performance is about output. It's about maximum delivery. It's about expectations and meeting expectations, and it's energy. If you look at, I spent 25 years in professional sports, and you look at the great performers, high performance is about this delicate balance. It's a very subtle art of output and recovery, output and recovery, output and recovery. And in the legal profession and any profession that's operating at that level, so the professional services all fit into this particular continuum. I think that one has to consider oneself almost like a professional athlete because your expectations on self are so great. So step 1, boundaries, technology. Step 2, boundaries, relationship boundaries. Are you setting aside 1 day a week for your family, for yourself, where it's just this reinvestment, this absolute reinvestment in self? Then we have to understand that nature is extremely valuable, and we've never really understood why until recently. So we assume that, you go into nature, you feel better. Why do you feel better? It's a green space, mountainous area, ocean, beach, whatever it is. We feel better. Why? And there's been this assumption that maybe, you're turning off and you're not stimulated. And it was never well understood. And a lot of the research came from Japan in terms of this notion of forest breathing, where individuals who are suffering from anxiety and depression would go into forests, and within a period of 15 or 20 minutes, they feel considerably better, whether they walked in the forest, whether they sat in the forest, whatever they did in the forest, they'd come out and they'd feel considerably better. And then they started evaluating neurochemical changes and hormonal changes. And what was discovered was the fact that there was a radical, I think there was 1 or 2 studies that showed that within 15 minutes, there's a 14% reduction in cortisol in response to being in these environments. That's quite remarkable. So we understand that there is a very strong neurobiological shift that takes place in our natural environments. Still not understood why. And then I think it was a team at, maybe it was Stanford or one of the other US universities, that were kind of looking at the experience of stress and focus and concentration. And we have to understand that the aperture of our visual field is very, very narrow. So when we focused on whether we're reading a document or whether we're reading an email or whether we're delivering a document or whether we're in a meeting, it's this very narrow aperture of focus. And that is very stimulating. It elevates adrenaline and noradrenaline, norepinephrine. When we go into a natural environment, it's the environment where our aperture completely expands. It becomes an expansive aperture. And by contrast, instead of becoming arousing, it becomes very much an autonomic trigger where we start having this regenerative and restorative and recovery experience take place based on our visual experience. It's based on our visual experience. Now, as a final kind of points on this before I explore one or two other pieces, there was this large UK study, and I think it involved 20,000 people. It was quite extended, and it was just looking at the prevalence of mental and physical health issues and the relationship between nature exposure. And what was uncovered in the study is that those individuals who experienced or were in green environments or natural environments for 2 hours a week, didn't matter if it was 10 minutes one day, 60 minutes the next day, just a collective total of 2 hours a week, had a low prevalence of psychological challenges or issues or mental emotional compromise. That's off the back of that experience. And I would subscribe to the fact that it does link to the aperture of the vision and probably other factors that superimpose and overlay onto that. But this is just the kind of basic departure point. You can't not be, it's an easy thing to do. It's create boundaries, an easy thing to do, to be in nature. It's not something that requires a lot of effort and a lot of input.
It can for someone that lives in a big city. And I was smiling when you were talking about the vision, because one of the exercises that I give my clients is to go from looking at a focal point, having that tunnel vision, into going lateral eye movement and actually practicing lateral eye movement in a very similar way that therapists would use it in an EMDR setting, because it actually relaxes us when we go and look at lateral eye movement. And that's something, as you exactly said, that we do naturally in nature, right? But we can recreate that in our place environment. And I find the result to be really transformative. Even in my own practice, when I feel slightly anxious after perhaps 90 minutes of emails, I make sure that I take this intentional 1 to 3 minute break where I will move my eyes horizontally without moving my head and take my little lateral movement break. And that makes a huge difference on my stress and I think level.
And it's certainly to your point, in that if you haven't got access to nature, there's always a way.
There is always
there's always an opportunity. We just have to create these simulations. And in many respects, healthy behaviors and healthy practices are just taking us back to our ancestral environment.
Oh,
so if you look at the prominence of cold exposure, I mean, in our natural environment, we're exposed to cold. If you look at physical exertion, high intensity intervals, cold ancestral environment, that was the experience. Sun exposure, first thing in the morning, over protracted periods in the day, natural environment. So fundamentally, I guess our physical, emotional, mental states operates in its greatest form, in its greatest capacity in that environment that has all but disappeared in modern existence, modern living.
And of course, I'm gonna be pushing you a little bit here, and let's say, as most of your clients are, I'm sure George is a bit cynical and hard to convince, let's say, and lives in a big city and says, "Richard, this sounds great. I love the sound of everything you said, the boundaries, the technology, the relationship, nature. But Richard, I have no time."
Well, that's okay. So then we'll work within George's context, and I think it's a common perception. And the reality is, you have to. It's a resilience skill. You have to decide what the outcome needs to be for yourself. You have a decision. You're confronted with challenge, and you're confronted with the sense of tremendous compromise. And here's this defining moment. What do I want the outcome to be? And this is the way I need to think. This is the way I need to behave. This is the way I need to act. But sometimes we are in a situation where, at this particular moment, I know what I want the outcome to be, and I will get there. But in this particular moment, I can't. It is not feasible. It's not practical. So we can kind of about to, and then we can say, okay, well, let's deal with another lever. And we're talking burnout, and we know there's this very strong molecular influence. The molecule is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So anything that has the potential to elevate brain-derived neurotrophic factor has the potential to mitigate some of the symptoms and experiences of burnout. because a depreciation or depletion of brain-derived neurotrophic factor by 15% is often associated with that experience, as well as other emotional and psychological challenges and experiences. So here we know that we can operate in many domains. If you haven't got time, physical activity is probably the greatest stimulus from a BDNF perspective, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor perspective. And we can say, okay, well, what's ideal? What kind of physical activity is ideal? Well, 30 minutes, 40 minutes is pretty robust. You can get between a 30 and 400% spike in BDNF, and that's very sustained, and it will elevate day in and day out to the extent that you'll have a tremendous buffer zone. But George might not have 30 to 40 minutes a day. In all probability, he doesn't. So we have to ask the question, what is the least amount of activity that can induce a spike of this particular protein, as well as other neurochemicals that will support health and well-being? And the answer is 7 minutes. So there's no ways that George can come back and respond by saying, I don't have 7 minutes. Of course, you've got 7 minutes. And if that's all it takes, do the bare amount or the minimal amount that you need to do in order to achieve a positive outcome. So what does it take? 7 minutes. If the 7 minutes is pretty vigorous, if George has a bike in his office or at home, that's even more helpful. If it's a brisk walk, it's a brisk walk. If he's got access to other physical fitness equipment, all the better. But it can be stairs, it can be a walk, it can be a bike, whatever it is. And the more vigorous those 7 minutes within reason, within safety boundaries, the greater the spike. So he can achieve a lot within a 7 minute period. If George has a cold and doesn't want to exercise or can't exercise for whatever reason, then we can explore other alternatives. The other alternatives would be perhaps intermittent fasting. So George could just skip one of the meals. I could skip maybe breakfast, he could skip dinner. And if he did that every second day for a period of 6 weeks, he would see a significant rise in brain-derived neurotrophic factor. But normally through the burnout experience, we tend to crave the alcohols, the sugars, the complex carbohydrates, and the saturated fats, and everything that's very delicious and pretty much not so good for us. But that's our craving. And if we had to have a little bit of like discipline and hold our line, so to speak, and just say, okay, well, I'm going to try and create a 16-hour or 16-hour, 17-hour window or gap in terms of meals, and I'll have the green teas, and I'll have a little bit of coffee, and I'll have the waters and things like that, but I'll just limit food intake. According to animal studies, you probably have a 500% increase or spike, a consistent baseline elevation of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Kind of applies to humans, probably not around 500%, but certainly very significant. If George is diabetic, then we say, okay, well, George, we can't be doing that, so we're going to have to find another alternative. What can you do? So then we can say, okay, well, George, if you had to get into a hot bath, and the bath is around 42 degrees, and you sat in that bath for 22 minutes or 20 minutes, it's not unpleasant to have a warm bath at the end of the day for 20 minutes. You'd have a 66% increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now we're saying that's pretty easy. You're now, in all probability, going to at least diminish some of the symptoms of burnout. Might not remedy it in its entirety, but certainly diminish. That's very doable. And then if George said, well, I don't have a bath at home because I live in Dubai, and we don't have baths in Dubai. Well, I just don't have I don't have 7 minutes. I don't have a bath, and I'm a diabetic who can't fast. Then we say, okay, well, George, what about an adaptogen? So he could consider, if he's not on medications and he's otherwise healthy, he could consider bacopa, which is, you can have a 99% increase in BDNF levels through bacopa. Curcumin would also be very effective. Rhodiola rosea would be very effective. And one or two other adaptogens would be highly effective. And these are plants that have been used medicinally for the last 2,000 years in Ayurvedic and Chinese medicine. There's always a way.
Curcumin
it's just
is
about
turmeric for some people.
Yeah, curcumin is a compound found in turmeric.
I'm so glad that you've brought up the notion of BDNF and burnout, because I'm personally a huge fan of the work that Dr. Wendy Suzuki has done in relationship to speaking of the importance of BDNF. And I still feel that it is perhaps one of those topics that is underspoken about, considering how significant it is vis-a-vis the burnout equation. For our audience that may or may not be familiar yet with this idea of BDNF and the role it may play in recovering and preventing, but also causing burnout in the first place. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about that?
So just to expand or expand, BDNF is a protein found in the brain. It's solely responsible for nerve cell expression. So the production of new brain cells, the maturation of brain cells, the retention of brain cells, connectivity within brain cells. It's also a trigger in certain other neurochemical expressions. One of the challenges with BDNF, so it has all these functions and all these roles, and beyond this, the structure of the brain, it's also largely associated with high IQs. It's largely associated with cognitive flexibility, largely associated with tremendous emotional stability. It just positive upon positive upon positive layered, emotional, physical, structural on every level. One of the big challenges with BDNF lies in genetic inheritance. A significant portion of the world population underproduces BDNF to the extent of around 25%. So you're always on the back foot. Anything that happens in your life, you have to just be mindful that you're predisposed to the expression of burnout. So just this physical depletion and this mental emotional volatility that comes with daily life. So there is a group that I don't know exactly what the percentage is, about 30% of the world's population thereabout, but I could be a little bit off, that does have a vulnerability to a reduction in the expression of burnout. But the biggest trigger in poor expression of BDNF is actually stress, chronic stress. I'm not talking stress today, tomorrow, this week. I'm talking stress over a period of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, where it's sustained. And I just kind of put the question forward, is anyone not chronically stressed today? It's just the nature of the world. I mean, forget about the external factors that we can't control. We've also got our daily lives to manage. And if you're a leader in a business or in an organization, you've got pressure from stakeholders, you've got pressure from your teams, you've got pressure at home, you've got pressure in your own personal capacity. So it's this very compacted set and this compaction zone that I'm referring to. But it's this chronic stress that has an absolutely disastrous effect on the expression of BDNF to the extent of a 40% reduction in expression. So anything that has the potential to offset that reduction in expression, there's certain adaptogenic herbs, exercise behaviors, lifestyle choices, lifestyle experiences that I've expounded on, like heat exposure and exercise and fasting and certain nutritional supplements. Anything that has the potential to protect and keep these levels stable under the stressful conditions that we live is the X factor in performance and X factor in expression. And Thrive has a very, very big narrative around BDNF and those things that elevate BDNF. But it's not the first book to do that. My first the stress code was even more expansive in terms of BDNF and those behaviors that have a positive influence. But fundamentally, to secure a stable degree of BDNF, I mean, one, it ripples over to so many different molecules within the brain. But two, it has a huge protective factor beyond the realms of burnout.
And some of the things that I think most of us, at least working in the corporate environment and having very sedentary lifestyle and working in busy offices, are often very guilty of, is the fact that we sacrifice fitness or working out and we live in extraordinarily comfortable environments. So AC environment, controlled temperature, I don't want to be too cold, I don't want to be too hot. And if you put this ingredients, always comfortable temperature, always sat down, you have your guaranteed equation for, right? So, and when we look at the science of BDNF, burnout, and those factors, sedentary lifestyle and seeking comfort, no wonder we burn out.
It stands to reason that it's the only expression in those environments that would manifest.
I'm a huge advocate of the Wim Hof method and cold exposure. And I feel very grateful to have also spent a lot of time in Finland, where I fell in love with the sauna culture. And this is really something that I do my very best to integrate regularly in my life, but also get my client to integrate in their lives because of the benefit. But do you find as well that sometimes when working with this executive or very busy professional, the idea or concept of having to put in effort to get better is met with a little bit of resistance, because typically these individuals are already putting so much effort into their work and career. I find that their effort cup is depleted. So at the end of the day, they don't necessarily want to do something hard because they've already done hard things all day at work, right? What is your experience with that?
So yes, very much so. I think that when you're in this depleted state, and the depletion extends beyond the physical, it's that emotional. I just don't have the resources to do anything beyond what I have to do. It's very difficult to even conceive a new model, or let alone apply it. And in this instance, we can look at basic stress, and we can break it down into the experience and how we manage each experience. And hopefully by bringing that in some sort of kind of level or under control, we can move forward in other areas of performance. So from an immediate stress perspective, if we can reduce the burden on our system, that in itself will help reduce the energy drain. So from an immediate stress perspective, the greatest channel, the greatest lever that we have is probably the manipulation of carbon dioxide. So if you look at Andrew Huberman and other related experts in the field, they've been proposing and certainly endorsing the physiological sign, where you take an inhale, exhale, and by doing so, that extra expansion of the lungs will help discharge carbon dioxide and give you a 5-minute window or respite on a sense of overwhelm. And that just gives your system a break. So if we in that difficult negotiation, or we stuck in traffic, or we have some sort of conflict that we're confronted with, and we need to remain calm and we need to remain centered, we can use the physiological side without anyone knowing, quite honestly. And it's something that's really quite prevalent in sports in those pressure situations. But the physiological side is not going to work for protracted stress, day in, day out. So you've got the high demands, you've got the long working hours, probably lack of support, probably the injustice perception that goes along with it. And that, as a compounded set, becomes very overwhelming. And is the physiology, you can sigh all you want, the entire day is not going to really make a difference. In that instance, we start having to leverage off a different system altogether. And that's the vagus nerve, which essentially is the body's off switch for stress responses. You can't change the psychological landscape, but you can change what's happening out there. But you can change your biological experience. And again, this is you're trying to hold on to reserves the best way you can. And in that instance, stimulating the vagus nerve, this is, whether it's the physical therapies, all the physical therapies are vagal stimulators, whether it's physio, osteopathy, chiropractics, massage, reflexology, they're all vagal, cranial sacral, all vagal activators. But then we also have other alternatives where it's slow, controlled breathing. There's no ways you don't have the resources all the time to take 3 minutes, 3 or 4 times a day, just to do a 5 or 6 count in, 5 or 6 count out, or a box breathing, a 5-second in, 5-second hold, 5-second release. It doesn't really matter as long as you slow your breath rate down considerably, about 5-6 breaths a minute. That's the key, and that will start reorganizing your system. And it's very simple. Alternatively, meditation or NSDR, non-sleep deep rest methodologies, anything that really kind of just slows you down and recalibrates you, not taking longer than 13 minutes, not requiring a maximum effort. Those are the vagal stimulators, and they have their place and their space. And then we kind of move on to the spectrum where you're so overwhelmed, the demands have been so great, and the pressure's been so protracted that you can try and breathe, you can try and meditate, you can try and have that massage, you can try and do anything, you just cannot center yourself. And in those instances, the molecule of choice is neuropeptide Y, a molecule that has one function, and that one function is to mitigate the experience of overwhelm. And it was seen in special forces, elite military units, that those individuals who express more of this molecule could handle more pressure with less compromise. And this is where the Wim Hof method really has its X factor. And the X factor is that cold exposure, deliberate cold exposure for a period where it's 90 seconds to 9 minutes at a certain temperature. It's relative to you, actually, what you find cold. That has a profound effect on raising the levels of neuropeptide Y, and it's a reset button. So at least a 6 hour, but more often than not, it's a longer period of reset. So we have all these choices available to us. And if we can get this under control for a period of time, and we're just being deliberate and being strategic, we then will have the reserves and the resources to then be more strategic and more pragmatic in how we approach the challenges that we face every day.
I was smiling because I absolutely love all that you said, but I had this vision in my head of the face that my clients pull when I first ask them to go into a cold shower or a cold bath. They're not particularly happy, and I usually get a lot of resistance. But with time, we get the results. I'm a huge fan of starting a day with cold exposure, even if it's just a few seconds in your shower, and finishing your day off with heat, whether it's your bath or your hot shower. And this notion of having this temperature in a kind of a rhythmic way, the way that I start off and the way that I close off, is a signal to my brain as well. Like, I'm about to start. This is time to shine, time to rise, and then it's time to relax. And I've really played with that notion of temperature, and plays a big role in my relaxation, but also energy strategy in the morning.
It's very potent, and sometimes I've experimented where I've done cold late in the day, but one has to understand that cold exposure increases norepinephrine. So you might feel a bit energized, but your whole sleep structure changes. You might fall asleep, you might stay asleep, but you don't have a lot of REM sleep, and you can wake up feeling very depleted from late cold exposure as opposed to early. Conversely, heat, there's no downside to heat. Sometimes today I actually inverted. I had heat in the morning, and I don't know if I love heat in the morning, but notwithstanding, I always enjoy the experience. And heat it's interesting because BDNF and neuropeptide Y, they both have a very profound effect on the experience of anxiety, in terms of they can mitigate and they can reduce the experience of anxiety, but through different channels and different mechanisms. So it's sometimes you can use the heat in order to just create a sense of calm and stability, and sometimes you can use the cold, and it's very particular as to and if and when and how you apply it, and you got to find what works for you. But I subscribe to what you're saying. Cold in the morning, start the day; heat in the afternoon, finish the day, and more often than not, you'll be able to handle so much more in terms of tolerance, physical and emotional.
And if you want a lot of free cold exposure, just go to Cape Town in the summer, our summer in Europe, which is your peak winter, which is what I did last year. And then you don't need to pay for ice in your bath. You just go straight into the sea and you get free natural cold exposure.
Exactly. The ocean sits at around in winter about 11 degrees, 12 degrees. So it's pretty cold.
It's pretty cold. Not quite zero, but cold enough.
Definitely cold enough.
Richard, one thing that I would love to really get your input on, because you've mentioned it twice, and it's something that is really close to my heart, as it is absolutely one of my mission statement when working with high performers in and across most industries, really within the corporate world, is this notion that there is so much to be said about how high performers in corporate need to start treating themselves like high performing athletes, right? To perform like a champion, you need to recover like a champion. That's really a message that I think is so important to have delivered across our industries. And you have spent over 20 years in professional sports. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about what is your message and how does your work within sports and the work that you've done with elite athletes has refined your message when working with professionals in the corporate industry?
So we often look at sport and we look at business as two separate entities. And the reality that they shouldn't be looked as separate entities at all, because there's so much overlap, and it's the expression of the fullest potential of self. I think that's what we're all seeking for and trying to achieve in life, is that full expression. And it's one thing to be successful; it's quite another to sustain success, which is almost the holy grail in many respects. So you look at a professional athlete, and they've completely immersed in the physical realities, the recovery modalities from a nutritional standpoint, nutraceuticals, the therapies, everything, and obviously there's sports participation, and there's a tremendous physical reality that exists. But every athlete's involved in the physical reality, but only a handful are able to achieve success when it counts. So what is that differentiator? And there's been a lot of research, and Thrive really unpacks that differentiator. It's psychological. So those who are best equipped in the psychological domain perform better. So yes, the physical is a base, and it's a foundational piece, and it's almost an expectation. It's a prerequisite to success. But the ultimate differentiator is skills, psychological skills, which we can call resilient skills. You then move across to the professional domain, and you say, what do we have in common with a professional soccer player, professional tennis player? What do we have in common? We have nothing in common. We've got everything in common. You're trying to achieve the extraordinary. Everything is in common. So whilst these elite athletes have to rely and leverage off psychological skills to differentiate them, in the business world, that's been your whole focus. It's cognitive. It's cerebral. That's what defines you, is a certain degree of excellence in this domain. But if you want to augment that skill set and give yourself this X factor, and that's pertaining to consistency and also the ability to achieve extraordinary insights, one has to start looking at the physical domains as a supportive infrastructure. So we see that to be the best in the professional domain, the best that you can be, you have to leverage off the physical. To be the best in the sporting domain, you have to leverage off the psychological. There's a beautiful marriage that exists between these two worlds. And everything really, I think, in so many respects, everything boils down to our neurochemical set. So if you need to be able to concentrate, if you need to be able to focus, the driving force in sustained focus is norepinephrine. So we've got this document. We've got to be hyper vigilant. We've got to be absolutely meticulous to the nth degree, and we've got to sustain a high level of focus for a protracted period of time. How are we going to achieve that? You're certainly not going to achieve it by having sugar lows and sugar highs, or caffeine lows and caffeine highs, or sleep deprivation. You're not going to be able to achieve that. Conversely, if you raise norepinephrine deliberately, let's say cold exposure, let's say certain forms of exercise are able to elevate norepinephrine. Certain nutrients like vitamin C actually is quite interesting in the norepinephrine domain. If you deliberate about elevating this molecule for certain periods of time, normally the period of time that you can create the elevation is around 6 or so hours. It can just give you that window of clarity that you're searching for. It's logic. Now, it's not to say that you then have to do the same thing 6 hours later and repeat and repeat. There's a finite capacity to keep these systems at an elevated level. The more you achieve flow and the more you get into these zones, the more depleting and tiring it is. So once you've achieved this degree of calibration, you're then going to have to understand that it's time to just take a break and just go into the restorative pattern, which seldom people are willing to do, let alone do. So it's this balance. And if you can find this balance, what we're able to achieve is far greater than we ever imagined. If you think you're doing well now, can you imagine what you could do with a very tailored and nuanced personal routine? But it's not just about these physical levers, it's about the environment that you're operating in. The environment plays such a crucial role. I mean, we do feed off the energy of others. There's this mirror neuron philosophy, to the extent that the energy that someone else brings into a room, or the behaviors or the moods or the perceptions that someone brings to environments, are the perceptions that we ultimately are going to develop and ultimately going to express. So we have to be very careful with environments. And in an environment that is extremely saturated with positivity, and we can do anything and we can achieve anything, and it's about commitment, it's about shared expectations. These are environments that bring out the best in us and just are able to tap into that intrinsic motivation that where our greatest self is housed.
And you mentioned something about this restorative balance. And when you look at athletes and you look at the world of sports, it's imperative that our athletes get this restorative balance and rest day and recovery, and it's embedded in the practice of peak performance. Now, conversely, in the corporate world, the notion of recovery and restorative balance is met with a lot more resistance.
100%. if you're not sleeping standing up, if you take lunch breaks, I mean, this is perceived as weakness. It's vulnerability.
Right. Yes.
And
You're
I
not
think
busy
that
enough. You have time for that.
exactly.
Well, you must have a very easy schedule, right? I've heard these things being said.
And I think it boils down to the notion of deliverables. It's like, what are you capable of delivering? And what are the conditions that you need met in order to deliver on those expectations? And I think we start looking at the results and stop looking at the incidentals and the cosmetics of the situation. I think that really is what counts. And the human body works off an ultradian rhythm. So we work in these 2-hour cycles, where for 90 minutes, we really can achieve a tremendous degree of output and performance, and we have great potential. And for 30 minutes of that 2-hour cycle, we're pretty flat and we're pretty disorganized and we can't think, and we can use that time very wisely. And that cycle generally starts around 2 hours after we wake up, or we can clock it at our peak will be about 2 hours after we wake up. And in those periods where we're starting to drop, instead of reaching for another coffee and trying to overstimulate ourselves, we can just start replying to emails of things that don't require a lot of cognitive or cerebral energy or commitment. So we can be very deliberate about how we structure our days, how we structure our hours, but just being mindful that in the course of a day, we only tremendous output, tremendous cognitive output. We probably can only achieve 2, maybe 3 cycles of exceptional work, and the rest is really filling in the gaps. And once that's done, we have to kind of start moving into a more restorative pattern.
And there is such a strong correlation as well with the respect of our ultradian rhythm and taking that ultradian healing low when you do the recovery protocol, when you actually have that restorative moment, and maintaining or entering states of flow. A lot of research shows that when you have this sweet spot of going into really hyper-focused mode, but also recover and enter those moments where you're in the zone, that's the definition of being in a flow state, which is valid for athletes and valid for the corporate world.
I think that is the ultimate aspiration, where everything is easy and everything is just organic, and we just have this clarity. We all seek a state of flow, and that state can only be achieved by an upregulation of a collection of neurochemicals. You would need raised serotonin, you'd need raised norepinephrine, raised dopamine, raised oxytocin, you'd need raised BDNF included. You need this cocktail to be elevated, and that elevation of that cocktail of molecules does come with a little bit of a downside. And athletes are all prepared for that downside. Following a very strenuous match or a high degree of exertion, they understand they'll be flat, and they go straight into a recovery period, and they go through this regeneration cycle, so that the next day they can come back at the same level and execute with the same degree of precision and exquisiteness. And I think that we can learn so much from the world of professional sport. And considering it's a business, I think the current value of the business is $5.2 billion a year. It's something that we could be well equipped to extrapolate tremendous insights, or certainly well positioned to extrapolate tremendous insights from.
Perhaps I'll ask you this one last question before we wrap up, is why do you think that there is a resistance to accepting the importance of resilience and recovery protocol, more so in the corporate world than there is in the sporting world? Why do you think there's still a gap?
Inertial defaults. This is how we've always done it. To change is impossible. Well, it's not impossible. It requires a significant object placed in front of you in order to create the change. So it's going to require a lot of your tech companies are quite innovative. They understand that creativity requires a certain set. So they put sleep pods in. They create an environment that is fun, that brings joy and happiness and lightness. They put it in the environment so that you don't feel that you have to escape the environment in order to recalibrate and regenerate. Could this not be applied within other areas and other professional contexts? I think it certainly could. So I think that, and it talks to Shane Parrish's notion of our defaults, the inertial defaults. We get stuck in certain ways. It's our safe space. It's our identity. It's what we know. It's what we understand. Any change in that framework is almost a threat to our belief system. So it's very difficult to change. But when one is trying to achieve a competitive advantage and trying to achieve excellence takes everything that you have. It's not achieved just by doing what everyone else is doing. That's not the notion of excellence. It's doing a little bit more, something special, something that is unique. And in order to create that environment, you have to, I think you have to create a facilitative space.
Well, you've spoken about excellence. I'm going to ask you a personal question now. How do you, Richard, maintain excellence? What are your non-negotiable habits, routines, or mindset that you cultivate and nurture in your life to maintain that level of excellence?
Well, so the non-negotiables is physical activity most days. And if I'm feeling flat or drained, it'll be something light. If I'm feeling energetic, I'll take it to the max. So physical activity is a non-negotiable. Some sort of research. So 30 minutes of cognitive stimulation where we're exploring new notions, new ideas, new frameworks, new research, just trying to elevate that curiosity as much as possible. So that's a non-negotiable. Cold or heat exposure is a non-negotiable. So one or the other or both every day. I try to get sunlight. It's a non-negotiable, but I don't always get the opportunity. I spend a lot of time in Canada, so not too much sunlight in the winters there. But I certainly do believe that sunlight exposure helps me quite significantly. And then NSDR, so body scanning around 10, 15 minutes every day, normally second half of the day as a recalibration tool is important. And always just trying to check in on cognitive biases or roadblocks. Often we get caught into thinking the same way, and it is to try and re-examine that thought process. Could there be a better way of doing it? Am I not seeing things clearly? So to try and check in, following every, whether it's every engagement or any session or any keynotes or masterclass, is just kind of look at different perspectives and how can I apply those perspectives to a new version, a 2.0, a 3.0, 4.0. So those are the basics that I try to put together. And sometimes there's nutritional supplements, sometimes there's not, but it just depends on the day.
And the things that you avoid at all costs?
Things I avoid at all costs is at all costs. I try to move from negative people. I think that negativity is very impactful. It does filter down, so I try to keep a distance. I try to also stay away from any excesses, excessive alcohol. I do drink, but is very moderately. Excessive sunlight exposure, anything in excess, generally, I try to. I wouldn't say that's all costs, but I try to minimize. But I think that kind of circling around again. I think that any negative influences in your life, that's the thing I try and avoid at all costs.
Thank you so much, Richard. I would just love for you to point our audience to where they can find out more about your incredible books, resources, research, expertise. If they want to find out more about your work, what would be the best place?
So my website, www.suttonhealth.co.za or www.theperformancecode.ca, either of those sites. LinkedIn is a good place to connect. Thrive is being released fairly shortly in January, so pretty much it should be everywhere. Amazon is always a great resource in terms of getting hands on the book. And I think that's LinkedIn, Instagram. Those are pretty easy avenues and channels.
I feel very lucky that I got to read the book as a premiere when I was staying in Cape Town before the global circulation. So I'm a huge fan of your work and your book, and I'll make sure to include it in the show notes so that I can benefit our audience. Richard, thank you so much for all your time, wisdom, and knowledge, insights. I've very much enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure our audience is going to take a lot away from this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for spending your time with me today and listening to this episode. Remember to subscribe so that you can receive weekly updates. And if today's message resonated with you, please remember to share it with a friend, a colleague, or a loved one who could really benefit from this episode.